There we go.
Thank you. My apologies.
Okay, are we ready?
Ready when you are.
Okay. Well, welcome. Good afternoon. We're going to spend a fun-filled afternoon talking about pruning trees. In particular, we're going to be looking at structural pruning using the natural pruning system. The natural pruning system is the one you probably are most familiar with. There are a couple of other pruning systems, things like pollarding and espalier and hedging, which are very different from the natural pruning system. Before we get started, I want to remind you that when you are pruning live tissue, you're reducing the plant's energy production because you're cutting off some of the tissue that can conduct photosynthesis and create energy for the plant. And at the same time, you stress the plant, you create wounds that the plant needs to use energy to close. You're opening pathways for pathogens, and it takes energy to fight them. You may also be changing the UV or the volatile organic compound signature, which can attract pests. And all of those things are going to require energy to deal with. So it's really important when you are going to prune that you are consciously thinking about trading off energy production against energy use, and that you are causing the tree or the plant to use more energy. When we prune live tissue in dicots, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit, that's also going to affect the tree's biological growth controls. And when we do pruning, we are frequently using this to manipulate the growth of the tree. So we're going to look first at some tree biology, so we're all up to speed on how this works. Then we're going to talk about how to prune, and we'll look at some applications, particularly to young trees, but I'll talk a little bit about pruning shrubs and root pruning and mature trees. So let's look first at the types of tissues that you find in a tree. There are basically three types of tissues. There's meristem, and I assume this is all pretty much review for you from your basic training. But the meristem are those cells that are capable of dividing and making new cells, and then they can differentiate into different types of tissue in the tree. The primary meristem is what makes the shoots and roots. It's responsible for height growth or width growth. The secondary meristem is what makes the new wood, and it is responsible for diameter growth in the tree. There's also the vascular tissue, which would be the vessels or tracheids. These conduct water and nutrients from the roots to the crown. They're found in the xylem of the tree. And then the phloem, which translocates the photosynthate. So the vessels or tracheids, depending on whether we're looking at an angiosperm or a gymnosperm, is what's moving water, while the phloem is what's moving the sugars around in the tree. Everything else is called ground. And some of the important types of ground tissue is the fibers that we find in the stems and the seeds. These are generally dead cells. This is what gives the structure to the tree. So we find a lot of fiber in the trunk, which is what we use when we are making paper or when we are making lumber or other products out of the wood. There's epidermal tissue. This is the outermost skin. It includes the bark, but it's not restricted to the bark. And this controls gas and water exchange. So some of these epidermal cells are still living. For example, the guard cells around the stomata in the leaves are living cells. And the last type is parenchyma. And this does lots of things. Most importantly, this is where photosynthesis takes place. This is where carb storage takes place. So this is where the tree will convert sugar into carbohydrates that get stored for the winter or for use in the future. And the parenchyma is also what makes the defensive chemicals that prevent rot and discourage pests. The parenchyma is all living tissue, but it's non-reproductive. That is, it cannot divide and make new cells, even though it is living in that it has the nucleus and all the other stuff that a cell needs for cellular respiration and to use the sugars that are made through photosynthesis. Now, these tissues play roles in pruning. The stem parenchyma makes the secondary chemicals that are going to protect the tree from pests and pathogens. This is only found in the sapwood. If you have heartwood, there is old dead parenchyma in it, and there are secondary chemicals that have been exuded into that heartwood, but no new secondary chemicals can be made in the heartwood. The secondary meristem is what makes the callus tissue, and the callus tissue, which is part of that meristem, is what grows the wound wood that closes the wounds. The primary meristem, on the other hand, makes the new shoots and roots to rebuild energy creation capacity as part of the, and also plays a role in the apical dominance. So primary meristem is what the tree uses to recover from pruning, whereas stem parenchyma and secondary meristem is what defends the tree from those open wounds and eventually closes them up to protect the tree from that. All right, any questions about the different types of tissues and why they're important in pruning? All right, let's move on to move on to wound closure. Wound closure is, of course, really important when we talk about pruning because we are making wounds on the tree and the tree has to close those wounds. In nature, trees mostly grow in forests. Excuse me. And so they have evolved to lose branches that get shaded in the forest. And that evolution is causes them to store defensive chemicals in the collar at the base of the branch, and also causes that secondary meristem, the cambium, to be primed to create the callus tissue that grows the wound wood. So you can see in this picture, I took this out in the woods, and here's the tree trying to pinch off this dead branch. This is one of the reasons we want to cut dead branches off the tree, is to make this process easier for the tree so it doesn't have to expend as much energy on it. So when we are pruning, it is really important that we protect these branch collars, because this is working by protecting the branch collar. We're working with the evolution of the tree and facilitating wound closure and reducing the harm that we do to the tree when we do pruning. Another important part of, at least for pruning, is what we call the branch bark ridge. So when we have a good branch union, there should be a ridge of bark on the interior between the two branches where the epidermis or the bark is growing against each other and pushing that ridge up. If you don't see a branch bark ridge, that means you've got a poor connection and there can be problems later on. We'll talk more about that. Another thing I want you to be aware of is a lot of people will call these lips that form around a pruning wound or any other wound callus tissue. That's not correct. You can't see the callus tissue. It's microscopic part of the cambium or the secondary meristem. What we see here is what's called reaction or wound wood. And this is where the tree is compensating first because there is a stress that occurs around the wound, but also is going to grow over this wound and close it eventually. Now, one of the practices that's not part of the natural pruning system that we run into frequently is topping. People do this, I think, because the tree they think gets too big. And so what they do is they top the tree. And this is making heading cuts between branch unions. In the natural pruning system, all pruning cuts are made at branch unions. We're significantly reducing the crown. In this case, we have removed 100% of the crown and completely removed the ability of this tree to make energy that it's going to need to regrow plant parts. It's relying entirely on whatever has been stored in the tree. And frequently when we look at top trees, we find root rot happening because the tree doesn't have the energy to defend itself from soil pathogens. So this is a bad practice and it's not part of the natural pruning system. All right, let's talk about tree biology and what I call the plan B in dicots. So as I said earlier, trees have primary meristem, which makes shoots. And this is an example of the primary meristem that has that was activated in the spring. You can see up here by my fingers, the stem is brown. That's last year's growth. All of this green stem is this year's growth. Well, as this is occurring in dicots, not only are does that bud contain cells that have differentiated it to become leaf cells and flower cells, it also will have new undifferentiated primary meristem that it leaves along the place that we can call axillary buds. These become suppressed in trees, but they're there in case that something happens and the tree has an opportunity to take advantage of new resource availability. One of the places you see this happening is when a tree is being shaded on all sides and you remove the shade from one side and now that side is getting sunlight, you will start to see sprouts from it. And those are those suppressed buds that are trying to take advantage of the sunlight that they are receiving so that they can contribute to make new sugars for the tree. And just so we're on the same page, I want to go through the evolution of trees a little bit. All trees are in the kingdom of plants. They are all vascular plants. Most trees are seed plants. We do still have tree ferns out there, which are spore-bearing plants. But then the seed plants diverge into what we call the gymnosperms, which translates as naked seed, and the angiosperms, which translates as covered seed. And actually, it should be naked ovule and covered ovule. So the angiosperms have a carpel that surrounds the ovule, and that's what makes those hard little coverings around the apple seeds in the core of the apple. That's the carpel. That's what we mean by a covered seed. The gymnosperms around here mainly are conifers and ginkgos, but then the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants in Magnolia phyta, which is a division, divide into the dicots and the monocots. The dicots are the plants that have two embryonic leaves, the monocots only have one. So grasses and lilies are all monocots. The trees that you find that are monocots are palms, so we don't talk about them too much. But the reason this is important, because I keep talking about the dicots, is the conifers and the monocots, the gymnosperms and the monocots, do not have those suppressed buds. So they don't have that ability to respond to new resources or recover from damage to the crown the same way the dicots do, because the dicots do have those suppressed primary meristem buds. And I think I covered most of this already. During growth, the dicots will leave behind this primary meristem in the form of axillary buds. The terminal buds, and this is important when we start talking about pruning, because manipulating those apical buds through pruning can either release or continue to suppress the axillary buds. We also know that the secondary meristem can form axillary buds, which is not good because it's not supposed to make buds. And so this is where sprouting comes from. And as I said, the gymnosperms and the monocots have very few, if any, axillary buds, at least in the above ground portion. The gymnosperms do have axillary buds in their root system, but the monocots don't. So when we see sprouts on trees, these generally result from the loss of apical dominance on the dicots. And this can be because of the removal or death of the terminal bud. It can be girdling of the branch by insects or disease, for example, emerald ash borer or Dutch elm disease. And they may result from either primary or secondary meristem. Frequently, they are a sign of disease. However, as I have said, sometimes if sun availability changes, those primary meristem buds can be released and start growing new shoots. We can also manipulate it to grow new shoots, particularly when we're talking about pruning shrubs or pruning really old trees that have started to go into retrenchment. And that's why I call this Plan B, because it is a method by which the dicots can recover from damage. And here is an example of Plan B. We'll talk more about this later. This is my Amorpha fruticosa. Back in February of 2022, I did an extensive rejuvenation pruning. This plant was about 15 feet tall when I cut it back to about 10 to 12 inches. And in the first summer, you can see all the new sprouts that came up. This has now got a much denser crown than it had. And this year it is full of flower buds right now. When we top trees, in addition to the other stuff, when we remove that apical dominance, we can start to see sprouting. These are usually very poorly attached sprouts. On this tree, that's not such a big, would not have been such a big deal. But when you start getting poorly attached branches up here and they start to get 2 or 3 inches in diameter and a storm comes along and they start getting knocked off, they can cause quite a bit of damage when they fall. It also can damage the tree. So we try not to top trees. All right. Just as a review of what I just went through is that trees have evolved to lose branches, which means we need to protect the branch collars. And we make the cuts at branchings because there are ways of manipulating that evolution. With the dicots, we can manipulate that Plan B to get to affect the growth rate. And not all, contrary to what some people will tell you, not all sprouts are bad. Some of it, you've got to look at the tree and figure out why is it sprouting. Frequently they are bad, but sometimes it's not a bad thing. All right, any questions about tree biology? Okay, then we will move on and we'll talk about how to prune. In the profession, tree care standards are set by the US, they're set by the the American National Standards Institute, and their standards generally conform to the International Standards Organization. But these are the two documents that basically set out professional tree care standards. The one on the right is from the International Society of Arboriculture. And if you read this, it's pretty bare bones. This goes into more detail and kind of elaborates on the standards that are found in the ANSI standards. Why do we prune trees? Well, there's some good reasons to prune trees. For training the plant, when we need to provide clearance or good structure for the plant. Hopefully you don't need to prune for clearance because you took that into account when you were selecting the plant and where to plant it. When we look at other systems, the espalier, the hedging, topiary, pollarding, these are all reasons that we different ways that we train plants for aesthetic purposes, or especially with espalier, that's frequently done with fruit trees so that you can grow fruit in a limited space in a garden. I know George Washington did that. We also prune to maintain health. In a lot of cases, especially with vascular fungi that get into the branches and things, pruning is one of the ways that we maintain the health of the tree and treat that by pruning out those infected parts. A good example of this would be black knot disease that occurs mostly in prunus, but it can occur in other rose family plants. And the way you treat that is simply prune those branches off that have the black knot fungus in them. We also will prune to improve safety. Part of this gets back to training the plant and getting good structure, so we're reducing the risk of failure or removing the dead wood. As I said, pruning out dead wood is a good idea, not only because from a safety standard, but it also makes it easier for the tree to deal with the loss of that branch by not having to pinch off that dead branch. And if you happen to be working in horticulture or arboriculture or orchards, we sometimes prune to influence flower or fruit production, particularly fruit production. They'll go in, and if there's been a heavy flowering and there's lots of fruit on the tree, they will sometimes prune off some of the fruit so that the tree can put more energy into the remaining fruit. Some other reasons that I've encountered is controlling the size. Again, this should have been done at the time of plant selection. If you only have room for a small or medium-sized tree, you don't plant a big oak. This also gets to controlling the size of the trees under power lines and other things like that. We sometimes people will talk about pruning for wind resistance. Excuse me. The science on that is up in the air right now, if you'll forgive the pun. What we are discovering is this idea of the crown of the tree being a single sail that is resisting the wind is being overturned, because all of the leaves and twigs and branches and things are all affecting the wind and the force vectors in there. And so as the wind blows through the tree, it's creating dead spots. It's turning some of those vectors around and they're pointing in the other direction. This is a process called mass dampening. And what we found is if you do not prune correctly, you can actually increase wind resistance of the tree. This is particularly when people lion tail. That is, they cut off all the lower branches and they leave branches up, everything at the top of the tree. Another reason people prune is to reduce shade. This is not one of my favorite reasons. My way of dealing with shade is you plant shade tolerant plants, not damage the tree for no reason. People also plant or prune to improve view and aesthetics. I'm a tree guy, so I don't understand how you can improve the view by cutting down the amount of the tree out there or the aesthetics. But people feel that way about it. And these are reasons that we prune. When we are pruning, this is how it works. You start by observing the plant. You set your objectives. You make a plan to reach your objectives, and then you make your cuts. And if you notice in this diagram, making cuts is a smaller box than observing, setting objectives, or planning. Because making cuts is the smallest part of pruning. Most of this should be going on in your head before you actually approach the tree with your clippers or your saw. So when we observe the tree, the first thing we need to know is what species is it? What are the common pests or diseases of the tree, and what is its normal shape? That's why we need to know what species it is. The reason we want to know what pests or diseases is we need to know something about how those pests and diseases work in the environment, and we don't want to take a healthy tree and make it susceptible to the common pests and diseases by pruning it when those things are moving around in the environment. We also want to look at the overall health of the tree. What's been going on with the weather? Have there been any significant site changes? What are the current issues? Why is it that we think we need to prune the tree? What are some future issues we may be seeing? Maybe there's a branch starting to grow off towards a sidewalk and is going to be a problem for clearance in the future. All of this gets into remembering that pruning is stressful. And so if the plant is already stressed or likely to be stressed, you may want to either not prune as much or not prune at all at this time, make some notes and come back to the plant at a later date when it's in better health and better condition to be pruned. When we're setting objectives, especially when we're looking at young trees, we want to know what is the future form of that tree going to be. Are there going to be clearance or structural issues that you may see? Maybe your objective is to maintain the current form, especially if you're talking about a hedge or a topiary or something like that. There may be diseased wood, there may be dead wood, which is what we call crown cleaning, where you're removing that stuff from the tree. So you need to figure out, what is it that I want to do? What am I seeing that leads me to think I need to make some cuts on the tree? And finally, the plan. What am I going to cut? Where am I going to make that cut? How much am I going to cut? There used to be a 25% rule. The standards now make that a recommendation, but they leave it to the arborist's judgment. In general, I would think as tree stewards, you really should stick to that 25% rule, which is you don't take more than 25% of the live tissue from the crown of the tree. The other thing you want to look at is the cycle. And some of this is going to depend on the age of the tree. If it's a young tree, you may want to do small or just a little bit of pruning every year, so you're maintaining as much leaf area to help that tree establish and help it grow into the environment. As they get older, you may take more and come back fewer times. If the tree is not healthy to begin with, unless the pruning is to improve the health of the tree, you may want to step back and say, we're not going to prune this year, or only prune what absolutely has to be done. You also want to think about what are the environmental stresses the plant has already been through and may be facing in the future. So you may have a long-term prediction of a hot, dry summer, maybe not such a good time to prune the tree. The bottom line is you don't want to be in a rush. There's very few things that need to be cut right now. So allow for wound closure. And don't feel like just because you've approached this plant or you've gotten out your pruning tools that you absolutely have to prune. Sometimes the toughest thing for an arborist is to look at the tree and say, I'm not going to do anything to it. We have, as a species, I think we have this need to feel that we have done something. And sometimes the thing you have to do is nothing. And we don't get that lesson enough. Human agency can cause lots of problems in the environment. As I said, when we are using this natural pruning system, all of your pruning cuts are going to be made at a node where branches join or there are buds present. The only time we violate that is when we go away from the natural pruning system to other types of pruning. But when we're talking about the natural system, we only prune at branches. All right, questions about that?
I have a question.
Sure.
When I did pruning around schools with Hugh Robinson, a lot of what we did was to remove lower branches in places where kids would be running by or along sidewalks where adults would be walking and might, hit the branches overhead. How important is that, for pruning?
That is part of what I just talked about. That's when I talk about clearance, that's what I'm talking about. Is room for people to walk by, room for cars to drive by. It's much better to make a good, clean cut than to have people breaking branches and damaging the tree because the branches are getting in their way. When I work with schools, I always recommend they put 4 or 5 stakes around the tree, not necessarily with guy wires, but just to keep the kids off of them with new plantings. So yeah, clearance is an important consideration. Ideally, that's something you take care of when you select the species and decide where to plant the tree. So if you plant the right tree in the right place, you don't have to prune for clearance. One of the big, it's not being done so much anymore, but it used to be people would plant pin oaks 3 feet from a sidewalk. And that is a continual clearance problem because of the way pin oaks grow. They're beautiful trees, but they should be planted far away from places where people are trying to walk. Okay. When we are making cuts in the natural system, there are only 2 types of cuts we make. One is a reduction cut. And remember, we are pruning at a branch union. So with a reduction cut, what we are doing is reducing the length of the larger branch. It's sometimes called cutting back to a lateral. With removal cuts, we are removing the smaller branch at that union. And like I said, both removal and reduction cuts are made at branch unions. So in the picture, I'm doing a removal cut because I'm cutting that small branch off of the larger branch. And by branch union, this is what I mean. And there are, like, as I said, two types of branch unions. For now, we're going to talk about making cuts at good unions. This actually, when I pulled up to this tree, it was in a parking lot. I was going to take a picture of it because I thought, oh, there's a bad branch union because we've got these two codominant leaders on it. When I got up there, what I saw was it had this nice U-shaped union and a very pronounced branch bark ridge. So this is actually a good union, even though you have codominant leaders here. Growing nearby was this tree where there is no branch bark ridge, and you can actually see a seam that runs down through the tree. So this branch and this branch are not really connected until you get down about halfway to the ground here. This is a calorie pair, and this is why calorie pairs fall apart, is because they have branch unions that look like this. And there is a way to deal with this, but it's different than doing pruning cuts at a good union. And we're going to start off by talking about pruning cuts at good unions. I think later on I may show you how you would deal with this, the issue on the left. All right. So reduction cuts. This is where we are reducing a branch to a lateral. So we are finding a lateral branch, and we're going to make that lateral branch, or the terminal bud of that lateral branch, now become the terminal bud for the whole branch. So you can see here, this is a red maple that's growing in my front yard. This piece was growing down, and I was starting to bang into it when I pulled into my driveway with my car. And I knew that was only going to get worse. So I did a reduction cut and shortened this branch at this lateral. And you can see here, the thing, I'll talk about this later, the aspect ratio, but you can see the lateral branch here is almost the same diameter as the main branch. And this is the cut I made. This is what it looked like after about 3 or 4 years. And this is what it looks like 2 or 3 years ago. This is 12 years after I made that cut. So this would have been in 2020. Now, the way we do reduction cuts is, again, we've got a branch union, you've got the bigger piece here, and you visualize a line, or you can actually draw a line across the branch from the branch bark ridge that is perpendicular to the axis of growth of the part that you're going to be cutting off. And then you make your cut to bisect the angle between that visualized line and the branch bark ridge. Now, this is not applied geometry. This does not have to be exactly bisecting the angle, but come pretty close, come as close to as you can eyeball it. For this, especially if this is a big piece, you may want to make a heading cut up here to take a lot of the weight off of the branch, and then do your final cuts down here. And here's an example of doing it with pruning shears. Here I visualize the line using the blade of the pruning shears. Then I rotated down. It's really hard to see, but there is a little branch bark ridge here that you can see. And I rotated down to bisect the angle and make the cut. So you can see I've got an overhand grip in the picture on the left, and then I've got a handshake grip in the picture on the right because I rotated my pruning shears down and before I made the cut. Now, the reason we do this is because, as I said, those terminal buds play a role in suppressing that primary meristem that are created during the growth process. When the terminal bud is removed, those suppressed buds can be released. But making your reduction cut like that allows the terminal bud of the lateral branch to take over the role in suppressing the buds below the cut. The other thing that you're doing when we do these reduction cuts is we are reducing the photosynthesis on that branch. Branches on trees are not like your arms and legs. They are responsible for making all of their own food plus more that they can send into the trunk of the tree. They get some back in the spring with the rising sap as the tree wakes up and starts sprouting out. But for the most part, they are responsible for making their own energy. So if we reduce the photosynthesis in that branch, we're going to slow down the branch growth relative to the rest of the tree. And I'll explain later why that's important. So those are the reduction cuts. The other type of cut we do is a removal cut. Now, as I said, we need to make sure when we do removal cuts that we preserve the branch collar. When we're making the reduction cut, we also have that branch collar in there, and it can work a little bit towards dealing with this cut. But preserving the branch collar is going to work with the evolution of the plant, and removal cuts always occur at the node. So if you look at this cross section here, this cut was actually not quite right, because you can see there's still part of the branch here, and the tree had to grow over that little stub there. If it had been made a little closer to the trunk through there, it would have taken more of this stub off. Now, in your book and in your training, you probably learned the Shigo method of doing removal cuts. And in that, it's very similar to doing that reduction cut. You have your branch bark ridge, you visualize the line that is perpendicular to the axis of growth, and then you bisect the angle between the visualized line and the branch bark ridge. And the cut goes through here, and that preserves the branch collar. Now, this is what Alex Shigo was a researcher with U.S. Forest Service back in the 60s and 70s. He cut up a lot of trees to learn about compartmentalization of decay in trees and how we should be doing pruning cuts. However, some researchers in Germany started looking at these Shigo cuts. And what they noticed is frequently there was this little stub sticking out here. So you get this kind of asymmetrical wound wood forming around that cut. And when they started looking inside the tree, what they saw was making that Shigo cut, you leave behind a little piece of the branch that the tree has to deal with. And what they proposed is a new way of making these removal cuts, which is actually a lot easier than doing all that visualization and everything. Their suggestion was you go to the outside of the branch, the outside edge of the branch bark ridge, and you make a cut that is parallel to the axis of growth of the larger piece. So you're cutting basically straight down from the edge of that branch bark ridge. And by doing that, you get rid of all parts of the branch. You're still preserving that branch protection zone and that branch collar, but you're getting rid of all the wood that's part of the branch and is going to die and become a hindrance in growing that wound wood. Now, I want to stress that they are not talking about making a flush cut. Flush cut is made inside the branch bark ridge. It makes a very big wound that takes off most of the branch collar in that branch protection zone. And you can see it creates a lot more decay within the trunk of the tree than when you make that cut on the outside of the branch bark ridge. So this is what it looked like. This was a horse chestnut, and they made these two cuts, and they came back 9 years later. They cut down the tree, cut it in half, and this is what it looked like. I took this picture of my neighborhood after that heavy wet snow we had a couple of years ago. This new cut, this branch broke, and so the landowner came out. He made the cut in the right plane, but he should have done it a lot closer to the tree because he's left a lot of dead wood. You can see up here, he's getting a nice rounded, symmetrical wound wood, but he still has a lot of dead tissue that the tree has to grow over. And I will say that actually this was not where he should have made the cut. He should have made the cut at ground level and done what we call full basal pruning, because this is a calorie pair, and we just assume he got rid of it. But this is still not, he's left too much of the stub here for this cut. Now, when we make pruning cuts, particularly when we're doing removal cuts, one of the things we have to be aware of is something called the shear plane. And if you hold your arm out straight out from your shoulder, you can kind of feel what's going on in the branch, because you'll feel some stretch in the muscles on top of your arm. And so when a branch is sticking out from the trunk of the tree, excuse me, the lower part is in compression, but the upper part is in tension. So the top fibers are being stretched while the lower fibers are being compressed. And in between those two is what we call the shear plane. This is where the forces inside the branch go from tension to compression. And sometimes what will happen is the branch will crack along that shear plane. So here's an example of a shear plane crack. This is, again, that heavy wet snow we had. Unfortunately, it was a complex shear plane crack because there were two shear planes in here. But you can see that's what caused the branch to crack. So because of this, when we do, especially like I said, with removal cuts, we want to use the 3-cut method. The first cut is undercutting through that compression wood. And I don't like this diagram, but it was the best one I could get hold of. This first cut should be deeper. And then we make the second cut outside the first cut, and this goes all the way through the branch. The reason for that first cut is to cut into either all the way into the shear plane or almost all the way into the shear plane. That way, if the branch splits as we're cutting it, that first cut will keep it from tearing down into the trunk of the tree and creating a much bigger wound on the trunk. After you make the second cut, then you can go and make your final cut, preserving that branch collar and removing that stub so the tree doesn't have to grow over it. And I'm not going to show you the video. This is a cut I made on my dogwood. But this is what happens when you don't use that 3-cut method. You can see that they started to cut through here and the branch cracked and it ripped down here into the trunk of the tree and made a much bigger wound for the tree to heal. Now, the question then becomes, do you do a removal cut or do you do a reduction cut? When we look at this and think about it, it's helpful to think of something called the aspect ratio, which is the ratio of the diameter of the lateral branch to the parent branch, that is, of the smaller piece to the larger piece. And depending on what that aspect ratio is, you should either make a removal cut or a reduction cut. And the critical aspect ratio is 1/3. So if you're looking at a branch that is less than 1/3 the diameter of the piece you're going to remove it from, you can go ahead and do that with few consequences. On the other hand, if that aspect ratio, if the diameter is 1/3 to 1/2, you may get trunk defects. And this is where you might consider doing a reduction cut and shortening that branch and slowing down its growth, and then coming back later once that branch is now less than 1/3 the diameter of what you want to remove it from. If it gets to more than half, you're almost certainly going to get defects, and you should then consider doing that shortening. And if it's large enough to have heartwood, that is, the branch you're going to remove is large enough to have heartwood, then you are likely to get defects, because now you're exposing relatively poorly protected wood to pests and disease. And so you might want to try shortening it instead of removing it. The other thing about the aspect ratio is we generally want the aspect ratio, if we're doing a remove or a reduction, to be greater than 1/3, although we can reduce to an aspect ratio of less than 1/3 if that's what needs to be done. The other thing about pruning wounds is when you are making good pruning cuts and you're working with the evolution of the tree, you don't need to seal or dress those wounds. There are some exceptions. For example, if we were out in the Midwest where oak wilt is common, usually we would do our oak pruning in the winter when the fungal spores are not present. But if you did, you might use some sort of a dressing. But when I say dressing here, I'm thinking of something like Lysol or some other disinfectant that will protect the tree from fungal spores, rather than the stuff they sell in the nurseries that is called wound treatment. I actually went online and I pulled this off the label. This is stuff that'll protect your pruned limbs, but it's also acting as a waterproof sealant. It's got lots of other outdoor uses. This is not the stuff that you want to put on your tree, because all it's going to do is get in the way of the tree closing that wound. What we also find is that it's going to seal moisture in and create this nice, warm, moist environment for the fungi to flourish in, and can actually do more harm than good. So we generally do not treat or seal wounds when we prune. Again, I mentioned dose and frequency and timing. You should avoid taking more than 25% of the live crown at any one time. Your frequency and dose are inversely related. So if you're going to take a lot, you should not be pruning that often. If you're only going to take a little bit, you can prune frequently. Some of my trees I prune every winter because that's when it's easy to see what's going on with it. But I'm usually only taking 1 or 2 small branches off of them rather than doing a lot of pruning on them at any time. The other thing is, the question is, well, when should we prune? And you'll find calendars that are talking about different times to prune different trees. A lot of that is predicated on taking 10 to 20% of the crown of the tree. If all you're taking is 1%, you can do that anytime. But if you're going to be doing some heavy pruning, it's generally not a good idea to do it, excuse me, at this time of the year, because the tree has just expended a lot of energy growing all those new shoots and leaves. And so you want to give it some time to recoup that energy loss. So you don't do your heavy pruning right after the tree has put out its leaves. Some other considerations, when we prune in late spring or early summer, so we're talking about June or July, you're going to get your fastest wound closure because the tree is actively putting on diameter growth at that time. So as I said, the secondary meristem is responsible for wound closure, and it's going to be most active at that time of the season. Depending on your species, sometimes if you prune it in the dormant season, you can get more spring growth because you've cut off a lot of buds and a lot of the things that are going to be using energy in the spring, and that energy can then be diverted to the growth points that are still there. There are some trees like maples and birches that you don't want to prune during the dormant season because you've created a relatively new wound, and when the sap starts to flow, they're going to bleed. There's going to be a lot of sap coming out of those wounds. That doesn't really hurt the tree, but it doesn't look good. So if you're working with a client and you do that dormant season pruning, then you see all that sap flow, they see all that sap flowing out, and they start complaining about it. And you say, well, that doesn't hurt the tree. It sounds somewhat disingenuous to the client. So not pruning those bleeders during the dormant season is more of a cultural thing rather than a biological thing. When you prune in the early spring, you can also slow down the plant growth because now you're pruning off a lot of the buds that were starting to form new growth. As I mentioned, oak wilt, which we do not have in Virginia, but is in the Midwest, Dutch elm disease, and several other types of diseases and pests. Those vectors are active during certain parts of the year, and you want to avoid pruning at those times. For some of our flowering trees like dogwoods, this is the time of year to prune them, because if you wait until later in the season, you're going to cut off all the flower buds. But as I said, this is only when you're doing heavy pruning. If you're doing light pruning, you can do that almost any time of the year. All right. Before we get into applications, are there any questions so far?
Jim, at what point are you going to talk about the best tools for pruning? Is that something we're going to do on Saturday, or are you going to talk about that today?
Not sure if we'll talk about it today or Saturday, but in terms of the best tools for pruning, especially the type, excuse me, I'm just getting over a respiratory infection, and we're going to take a break here in a second. In terms of the type of pruning I would expect tree stewards to be doing. You're talking about hand pruners or loppers that are bypass. So you don't want the anvil pruners, which only have one blade coming down on a flat surface. That will crush and tear fibers rather than cutting them as you do with the bypass pruners. And a good 7 to 12-inch tree saw, either a folding one or one of the ones that is in a sheath, are really the only tools that you guys should be using. I'm pretty sure the tree stewards do not want you using chainsaws and climbing trees. So those would be the things. You might also get a pole saw if you felt the need to be doing lower branches that you can reach from the ground.
Another question.
Sure.
You just said that you could prune any time of year for light pruning. How do you define light pruning?
1 or 2 cuts.
Okay.
Especially, I mean, 1 or 2 cuts of smaller branches. I had a 3-inch diameter branch on a dogwood that we wanted to get rid of, and I waited until the winter to do that. That's not light pruning because I was taking about 5% of the canopy with that branch. I'm talking about 1 or 2% of the canopy, if that much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I've been talking for 1 hour and 2 minutes now, so let's take about a 5-minute break so I can rest my voice a little bit and get some more stuff to for that, and we'll get started again. Let's see, my clock here says, oh wait, I've got my phone, which will be more exact. It says 2:05, so we'll get started again at 2:10.
Nora said in the chat to stop the recording right now.
I think if it's only 5 minutes, we can leave it on. It'd be fine.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
John, we will have access to these slides, right?
Yes, I believe so. After, I'm pretty sure he sent them to us last time. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, I thought I'd seen them before when I was on my own, so, okay, thanks.
Okay, are we all back? It looks like the same group that we had before. Now, I was just looking at my phone. It was telling me this class is supposed to go till 4 or 3. All right, my calendar says 4, so that's
It's slated until 4, yes, Jim.
okay. All right. So now I want to take what we've just talked about, or what I've talked about, and show you how it can be applied, particularly to training young trees. And I will tell you, this is not what you should do to young trees. I was out with, this is actually in your guys' neck of the woods. I forget the name of the community, but it was somewhere over there in Arlington or Alexandria with, it's an condo association. I was out with, it's actually one of the Fairfax tree stewards who lived there. And we were walking along and we came across this, and they just sighed and said, yeah, the guy who did this claims he knows how to take care of trees. And I said, well, you guys know this is not the way it's supposed to be done. So the first thing I want to get to, because this is the youngest tree you're ever going to deal with, is the tree that you just planted. You should only be pruning dead or broken branches at the time of planting. If there are competing leaders, rubbing branches, you make a note of that, but you really don't want to prune that tree until it gets established, because newly planted trees need energy to grow roots. And the last thing you want to do is remove branches from that are going to be able to provide the energy for growing those roots until the tree gets established. And in this area, establishment usually takes 1 growing season per inch caliper. So if you plant a 1-inch caliper tree, it's going to take at least a growing season where you're going to have to give it supplemental watering to get established. And then you can start thinking about pruning it. Early on, I taught a pruning class. I guess it was for the tree stewards or the master gardeners. Anyway, somebody in the class had downloaded something from the internet that said that you should prune off 1/3 of the canopy of a newly planted tree and then spray it with a desiccant. I usually try not to be so blunt, but in that case, they said that's wrong. Do not do that. Because exactly what I said, pruning off all that live foliage is going to reduce the energy budget of the tree. Spray with a desiccant, that causes it to close its stomata, which means it's not getting carbon dioxide. So not only are you reducing the leaf area of the tree that could be doing photosynthesis, you're also preventing what's left over from doing photosynthesis. Fortunately, that was a prescription from 1972, so we don't do that anymore. That's why I say pruning is not a substitute for watering. All right. So when we are doing that first step in pruning, and we're looking at a young tree, again, it's important to know what the species is. Generally, we talk about pruning for a strong central leader, but that's not always the case, especially if by tree we mean any self-supporting woody plant, because some species do not grow with a strong central leader. So you don't want to force it in there. I actually saw, what was it? A gray dogwood, which is a cane type shrub, I looked at that tree, at that plant for a long time before I could figure out what it was, because it had been pruned to have a single leader. And there was a button bush nearby that I couldn't identify because it had also been pruned to have a single leader, which is not the way those plants grow in nature. And somebody, was actually some master gardeners that I was with, and they said, yeah, that's a button bush. And I went, okay, that explains the little buttons. All, it was in the winter, so there were no leaves. That explains the little buttons all over it. But this isn't the way button bushes are supposed to grow. So you do need to know what that tree is supposed to look like before you start pruning for a strong central leader. In general, anything that you would consider to be a canopy tree is going to have a strong central leader. The other thing you need to figure out is where the lowest permanent branch is. So this gets to the earlier question about pruning around schools, so there's room for the kids to run under the trees and there's room for the adults to walk under the trees. And that's going to pretty much determine where your lowest permanent branches are. Then you want to be looking for potential scaffold branches. And this relates to that lowest permanent branch. So in a lot of cases, especially if it's a very young tree, you may be looking at a tree that doesn't have any permanent branches on it yet. And all of those branches are going to be removed. You also want to, again, ask that question, has it suffered from recent stress? Planting is stressful on trees. So if it's only been recently planted, you may not want to be pruning it yet. And this is where you really start thinking about what are some of the future problems. You may be looking at this tree and saying, well, here's the lowest permanent branch. There are these other branches. They're going to become clearance issues if we let them grow. And that becomes then a basis for setting your objectives. So you may look at the tree and say, it's got a competing leader, but remember that competing leader is providing energy to the plant. And for young plants, that becomes an important consideration. So rather than just remove that competing leader, maybe you want to reduce it. You may be also looking at those temporary branches, and remember the aspect ratio of 1/3. You want to make sure that any branches you believe are going to be coming off this tree in the future don't get too large relative to their parent, so that when it comes time or sometime in the future, you may be able to remove them safely. And you may want to start looking at and saying, well, okay, this is going to be my first scaffold branch, and start pruning to create those scaffold branches, especially if you can do the lower branch, those lower scaffold branches, standing on the ground with a hand pruner by simply taking off a few little twigs that are growing in a place that's not good. Maybe they're competing with your lowest scaffold branch.
Could you
So-
explain what a scaffold branch is? I'm sorry.
Those are the main branches that hold up the canopy of the tree. So in a big mature oak, those would be the great big branches that are attached to the trunk of the tree. And I'll show you a picture later on, I think. So in the first 5 to 7 years, most of the branches at the time of planting are temporary, and most of the branches that it's going to start developing in those first 5 to 7 years may be temporary. You want to plan for that for a single central leader, if that's the natural shape of the plant. All of those branches that are greater than 1/2 the trunk diameter, you want to do reductions on. That's going to slow them down so that in the future you can remove them when the aspect ratio is below 1/3. Again, the same thing where you are planning for and you're starting to work towards that central leader, the low vigorous branches. So what you are mainly doing in those first 5 to 7 years is you're looking for those things that may become problems in the future. But again, you're balancing the energy need of the plant against the structural needs of the plant. And so you're probably going to do more reduction cuts than removal cuts during this time period, because what you're trying to do is slow those branches down, but still leave that leaf surface area to support the overall health of the tree. So when we talk about central leaders, here is about I planted this tree about 3 years before I took this picture. When I evaluated it, this is a crabapple. It had 2 competing leaders. This yellow line is the one that I wanted to keep as the central leader. The red line is competing. And so looking at that, I knew that I was either at some point I was going to have to remove that branch, or I was going to have to turn it into a scaffold branch. But at this point in time, my most important consideration was keeping this from becoming too big a competition for that other leader. I also was considering where the lowest branch would be. Notice I planted this tree in the strip between the street and the sidewalk. So I was worried about cars either driving by or parking over here and pedestrians on the sidewalk. So I anticipated that this was going to be my lowest permanent branch, and everything below it was eventually going to come off the tree. If that was the case, then I knew I needed to manage those branches so they weren't too big. That didn't necessarily mean I had to remove them. And actually at that point in time, I didn't even have to do reductions on them. And the reason you want to be frugal and careful about this kind of thing is that, as it turned out, because of the upright structure of this plant, that was it turned out to be my lowest permanent branch. So if I had thought, well, all these branches were going to come off, I would have removed a lot of the future canopy of that tree that did not have to be removed. So this is what I meant by being patient and taking time, allowing the tree to develop, watching for what may be a problem in the future, and using those principles that we talked about slowing the growth rate of the tree. So back in 2008, what I was looking at is these branches would have to be removed, and I wanted to control the size to keep them below that 1/3 trunk diameter. I wanted to maintain that aspect ratio. That way, when I finally did remove them, they would be smaller, but I was still trying to balance the need for photosynthesis against the structure of the tree. The other thing, we mentioned the scaffold branches. So these are those branches that are attached to the trunk of the tree and hold up the crown of the tree. This usually starts with the lowest permanent branch, and you want them to be spaced both vertically and radially so they're not competing with each other. So along the trunk, we're looking at 18 to 36 inches between branch 1 and branch 2 that are over each other. And then they can also be radially spaced. They should also be radially spaced around the tree. So willow oaks are notorious for crowding their scaffold branches. So you can see there are 3 branches here that were all growing in pretty much the same place and all trying to become scaffold branches. As it turns out, they were also growing towards the house. So the previous owner actually did most of this pruning, but this would not be a good arrangement for the scaffold branches. he might have chosen one of these branches to leave on and the rest to remove. Here's another example. You can see these two branches that are only about 8 inches apart, and they were grown during when I had some pruning done a few years ago. I had my arborist cut the lower branch off and kept the upper branch, because otherwise these two branches would have been in direct competition for each other. When we talk about future problems, most of those hopefully have been dealt with by choosing the right tree and planting it in the right place. Clearance, over long branches, and future rubbing are all future problems that you might run into with a tree. And with this, you want to apply that principle of temporary branches, which means you don't necessarily have to remove them, but you might want to reduce them to keep them small. So when they finally do have to come off, it will not create too big a wound on the tree. So here's an example, case study. This is again my crabapple. And when I did the evaluation, I found two big problems that I had to deal with. The first was that I already mentioned the competing leader. And the second, and you can see in this picture down here, this was a very large, vigorous branch that was growing out towards the street. And if you look at it in this picture down here, you can see the aspect ratio here is close to 1. So this branch was almost as big as the trunk of the tree, and it would have created a relatively large wound on the tree if I had pruned it off at this time. So how did I deal with these? Well, this is the competing leader. And you can see what I did was I found a lateral branch on the competing leader, and I did a reduction. And you already saw these pictures. And this is the wound that I made with that reduction cut. Over time, this is what happened with that wound. So this is what it looked like in October 2008. 3 years later, you can barely find the wound, and I don't have any more pictures because I don't know where this wound is on the tree. But also notice that the branch is straightened out, and there was a significant difference between the diameter here and the diameter here. And now, 3 years later, the diameters are almost the same. So you can barely tell that there was a kink in this branch. When we look at the connection, this is what it looked like in 2008. 3 years later, notice the change in the aspect ratio and how much smaller that branch is relative to the trunk of the tree. And by 2020, 12 years later, there is a significant difference between the current central leader and this one that was competing. And as it turns out, that branch is now one of my scaffold branches that's holding up a major part of the crown of the tree. That large lower branch, I did the same thing. I went out here, I found a lateral branch, and I did a reduction cut. Now at the time, the 1/3 ratio was pretty much a rule, and I was not as experienced as I am now. If I were doing this today, I would probably use this lateral rather than this lateral, but I chose this one because it was larger. And there's the cut that I made and the lateral. When we look at what's happened, what happened over time, you notice the aspect ratio, as I said here, is close to 1. 3 years later, it was significantly below 1/3. And at the time, just after I took this picture, I did do a removal cut because this branch was still growing out towards the street. And in 2017, this is just 9 years later, this is the wound that I had made and how I dealt with this. So by simply doing those 2 reduction cuts, and somebody asked what it meant by light pruning, that's light pruning. I was able to solve 2 significant problems with this crabapple tree. One of them, I never had to do anything more to that branch. The other one, I knew I was going to have to take it off later on, but I was able to go from a very unsafe cut to a very safe cut. And you can see how the tree responded to it. So this is what I mean by manipulating the biological growth patterns of the tree. In 2016, this is what my tree looked like. Again, in doing the evaluation, I found this one branch that had started up here growing right along the trunk of the tree. It's a very small branch, so I made that one cut, and that was all I had to do in 2016. I continue to monitor this in the winter, look for problems. I do have a couple of branches that are getting close to rubbing against each other. And again, I made a reduction cut to slow one of them down so that eventually I can remove it if I have to. Now, when we talk about pruning evergreen, but before we go on, let me ask if there are any questions. Okay,
I just have one question
Sure.
quickly. I have a young white oak that I transplanted. It was a volunteer from my front yard, and I transplanted it to my backyard. And
okay.
it's now at least 4 years old, and it's got many leaves, but it's still only about 1 meter high. So it looks like a bonsai. And I'm just wondering, is it growing as a dwarf, or will it start to grow?
Is it in a lot of shade where you transplanted it?
It's in part shade, yes.
Okay,
There's some big trees, but there's none that are, in its shade that are within like more 20 feet.
okay. So oaks will take a little time to get established and to really start to take off. I mean, it's well established where it is if it's been there for 4 years, but they do have a tendency to the first several years of its life to really focus on growing roots, partly because of their growth patterns and things, but also because they frequently are growing in the shade and they've adapted to that. And so it can take several years for them to say, oh, okay, I got my roots under me, and really take off. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 3 or 4 years that tree does start to put on some height, especially if it's getting part sun. If it's in the shade, it can grow suppressed for a long time. We've cut down oak trees in the forest that were only 2 or 3 inches in diameter and only about 15 or 20 feet tall. And then when we counted the rings, found out they were 75 years old.
Wow, okay.
On the other hand, I have an oak tree that was planted by a squirrel in 2005, and it's now 30 feet tall.
Wow.
So a lot of it has to do with the site conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. When we prune evergreens, one of the things that I told you is you don't have that plan B. So especially the world conifers, things like pines and spruces and firs, they generally have a single stem and they'll get a new whorl of branches every year. In fact, the eastern white pine, you can tell how old it is by counting the branch whorls on it because it produces one whorl every year. And at the end of those new branches, there is another bud. And every year, those buds will continue to grow out in the candles. And at the base of the bud, you'll get another whorl of branches. Unlike dicots, if you make reduction cuts, especially if you reduce with dicots, if you reduce to a bud, and we'll talk about this when we talk about pruning shrubs, you can actually release those primary meristem suppressed buds and get growth there. Doesn't work that way with conifers, especially these world conifers. So for pines and spruces and firs, we only make removal cuts. I saw one white pine that somebody did reduction cuts on, and all that resulted in was a bunch of dead branches sticking out of the trunk. So you go back to the trunk and you make the removal cuts. If you want to get it to be bushier, you can pinch off those candles, and what that does then is it stops, the branch stops elongating, and the side branches will grow more. That's what Christmas tree growers do to get good structure on their Christmas trees, and lots of needles in there. But it's really simple when we talk about these world conifers. You do removal cuts at the trunk, and that's pretty much it. Usually you don't have to do any kind of training when they're young because they have such strong apical dominance. They only produce the one branch. If you see one of these world conifers that has competing leaders, that usually means the top broke out of it and those branches now are competing with each other. That used to be lateral branches are now competing to be the leaders. With the random branched evergreens, things like yews and arborvitaes and cedars and fall cypress, junipers, generally, if you leave them alone, they will have a strong central leader. So you don't need to train it. Now, if you want to turn it into a hedge, then you do have to do a lot of training by cutting that strong central leader. And that's going to encourage those side branches to grow more strongly and start trying to become the central leader. Usually these things get pruned in late summer or late spring or summer. If you prune it during the dormant season, you're going to get a lot of vigorous spring growth because, again, you're pruning off a lot of those growth sites. So what's left are going to get more energy and they're going to grow more. When we talk about pruning evergreens that are dicots, things like magnolias and laurels, some of our hollies, some of the rhododendrons, these are dicots. So everything we've talked about so far applies to these species that are the broadleaf evergreens. Okay. Any questions about the evergreens?
Yes, I've got a question. A lot of the evergreens, and at this point, I can't really remember what kind they were, have a lot of, as they get big, they have a lot of dead branches at the bottom. And the instinct is always to, take care of dead branches, but it seems a lot of times that's just their normal behavior. And I wonder if that a different sort of a rule applies to that one. They could be arborvitae, they might be pine.
The dead branches can be removed from those trees. In fact, it's a good idea. The one that I really think about is the eastern white pines. When they get shaded, they'll leave those stubs when those branches die, and those can be pruned off. Things like loblollies and shortleaf pines, though, will not leave the stubs, and they will prune them off. The one caveat there is, especially for the non-native conifers, things like Colorado spruces and other spruces, and some of the European, like black pines I've seen have been getting needle cast, and they will die from the bottom up.
Mm.
So you do need to be careful about that, because that could be those dead lower branches, especially on the ones that have really dense crowns, and usually come from either higher altitudes or higher latitudes than we have here in Fairfax. Those dead lower branches can be a sign of a particular disease that will kill them. Because what happens is, with all that dense foliage or the dense crowns like you have on the spruces, you don't get as much air circulation. They evolved in cooler, drier climates, so you've got a lot of humid air inside that crown that's not moving around, and you get needle fungi that start killing those needles, and they usually start at the bottom and work their way to the top of the tree.
Another question, you were just talking about pruning evergreens
Uh-huh.
to reduce width. How would you approach that?
How would I approach what?
You were talking about pruning evergreens to reduce their width. How wide? How would you approach that?
Ideally, what you're going to do is make a lot of little cuts where you go back to a stem. But most often people just use, do it like a hedge, where you're cutting the just the tips of it. And for the ones like arborvitae and cedars and yews, that works fine. That's not going to hurt them too much. Or junipers rather, not cedars. Otherwise, as I said, you'd want to follow that branch that's sticking out too far back to a branch union and make the cut there.
Thank you.
And if you're going too far into, if you wind up, you're cutting off too much of that branch, it may be just you go all the way back to the trunk and cut it there. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. When we talk about pruning shrubs, most people are planting shrubs for their flowers. There are some shrubs that people plant, like hazelnuts, that don't really have particularly good flowers right now. The viburnums are in bloom. I think the shrub dogwoods will be coming out in another week or so. The mountain laurels are blooming. And so you want to be careful when you prune these things. And it's also true for trees. So for like cherries and crab apples and things like this, you need to know whether they are flowering on new wood or old wood. And to a certain extent, what this is the buds on the plant, and it depends on the plant. Some of them do it differently than others, but the buds, the primary meristem is differentiating into flower, or into cells that are going to become flowers, or cells that might become leaves, or cells that might become stems. Now, plants that so-called bloom on old wood, things like rhododendrons and flowering dogwoods, generally what's happening is that flower meristem is forming either in the late summer or the fall or the winter. So it's forming the year before. And typically these plants that bloom on old wood are early bloomers. Things that are blooming in late May and June or in the summer are usually blooming on new wood. And so what's happening is the flower meristem is being formed as the shoot elongates, and the buds are being formed in the spring after you get your early spring growth. And for those, you want to prune before bud break. So the ones that bloom on old wood, like the flowering dogwoods and the rhododendrons, you want to prune those right after they flower. Otherwise, what happens is you prune off the flower buds and then you don't get any flowers the next year. So for example, this is the Pinkster azalea, rhododendron, paraclimeniodes. The picture on the left was I took in January. You can see that great big flower bud. And then you can also see these smaller buds, which are new shoots that will be coming up. And then in May, actually this year in April, that big flower bud becomes this rosette of flowers, and then you start getting new shoots. And what will happen is over the course of the summer, these new shoots will then create another flower bud. So you want to prune those things right after they flower, so that you're pruning them before they start forming their flower buds. But if you wait until the winter to prune them, you wind up cutting off all the flower buds. On the other hand, Plethora summer sweet, this is what they look like right now. It's just new shoots and leaves, but there are no flower buds visible on these things. So you can prune those during the dormant season or right at the beginning of spring, and you'll release other buds that will become new shoots. And then in July is when these things bloom. So these are summer bloomers and they bloom on new wood. And this is a consideration if the reason you put this in was you want to have these flowers either for pollinators or just because they're pretty. One of the new considerations, though, as people start talking about native plants and supporting wildlife, is especially these things that bloom on old wood, like this dogwood. If you prune it right after it flowers, then you're going to be pruning off all of the old flower buds and all of the seeds that it would produce this year. Whereas if you wait until after the seeds are eaten by the wildlife, then you wind up pruning off the flower buds. So you can see the bud here and the seeds here. And if both of these are considerations, this again gets to that idea of you don't have to do everything at once. So you may evaluate the plant and say, these are my objectives, and my plan is I'm going to prune this half of the tree this year and sacrifice next year's flowers and berries. And then I will prune the other half next year and sacrifice the flowers and berries for the following year. And this way you can still get some flower production and some berry production. In the old days, when all we cared about was the flowers, it was not a problem. You would just prune those things right after they bloom. Okay, let's talk more generally about pruning shrubs. Now, we are still going to be using reduction and removal cuts that we're going to be making at nodes. And branch unions are still going to be considered nodes. But now we're also going to consider buds to be nodes. And we will consider the ground to be a node. So with shrubs, we may be making reduction cuts at buds as well as at laterals. And we may be making removal cuts at the ground as well as at branch unions. And this really depends on how the shrub grows. And we'll talk about a couple of different ways that shrubs can grow. So when we talk about reducing to a bud, it's similar to making a reduction to a lateral. The difference is you don't necessarily have that branch bark ridge, so you got to kind of use your judgment. This cut should be between 30 and 45 degrees. If you cut or you make the cut too angled, the bud may dry out and this node may no longer be available. If you make it too high, then you wind up with all these stubs. And I have seen trees or shrubs that came from the nursery that were pruned like this, and they've got all these dead stubs here where they're making those pruning cuts above the nodes. And it will take a few years for the plant to deal with that and get rid of those things. And the reason we're doing this is, remember that when we talked about making the reduction cut at a lateral, what we wanted was for this bud on the lateral to control the growth down here. Now, it may look like making this has allowed this thing to sprout, but you can see there's already a well-developed bud here. Whereas when you make the reduction to a bud, this one little bud here is probably not going to be able to take over as the terminal bud and suppress this. So you wind up with a lot more growth going on here because you don't have that the dominance again that's suppressing those buds. And that's the reason that we make that reduction to a bud, is because we are trying to encourage sprouting. And as I said, now there are some arborists that are specializing in trees that are in retrenchment, and this is exactly what they're doing up in the crown of the plant, is they're making these reductions to very small laterals or to buds to encourage more growth in the top of the crown of the tree. So there are basically, in my consideration, there are two types of shrubs. There are what I call dendritic shrubs. These are shrubs that grow kind of like trees, where there will only be one distinct root plate with one or just a few trunks coming out of them. And then we'll talk about the cane type shrubs in a minute. So this one is a red buckeye, and you can see it grows like a small tree. It's got a single stem, then it branches off. This is one of those species that does not have a well-defined central leader, but it never gets very big. And you can prune this just like the trees that we've been talking about. The other type are these mounding shrubs, things like boxwood, and this is an Asian rhododendron. Typically, especially if we are trying to control the height of the shrub or reduce the height of the shrub, you make your pruning cuts in a cone here in the middle of the tree, of the plant. And this is where you want to make those reductions to a bud or a small lateral to encourage growth going in here, because if you've explored these things underneath this outer layer of leaves, there's a lot of empty space, and when you start pruning these things out, you wind up with a bald spot here. So making those reductions to a bud will encourage that plant to start growing more foliage in the middle to compensate for what you pruned out. And my wife actually complained to me about this is in the front of my, or was in the front of my house. She complained that this thing was getting too wide. And so what I anticipated was that I was going to, above this red line, reduce the laterals or do reduction or removal cuts in here. And then right at this edge is where I would be looking at reducing to buds pointing in. But after we discussed it more, she explained to me that her problem was not how tall it was getting or how wide it was getting along the sidewalk. It was that she had planted stuff down here that was getting shaded out by this. That made my job a lot easier, because then all I had to do was make reduction cuts or removal cuts to get rid of all this stuff to cut it back. And again, you want to go into and make that good removal cut at a branch node or at a branch union. I also noticed that we had a little colic here and a little colic here, and so I did some reduction or removal cuts to get rid of those things. But it made my job a lot easier because I didn't have to worry about filling in a bald spot here. And so this is a removal, or actually this is a reduction cut I made. I followed that branch down here to, actually there were several leaders here, and I just made a removal cut here, or a reduction cut here. It turns out it didn't make any difference because a year after I did the pruning, she said, we're going to get rid of it. So it's not there anymore. Then I mentioned the cane shrubs. So this is that Amorpha fruticosa, which is what I call a fountain cane shrub. So you've got a lot of, most of the growth is going into a single stem coming out of the ground near this root plate and kind of fountaining out spireas and those the forsythias grow like this too. And then I also have you also have these other types of cane shrubs like these Viburnum dentatum's and the shrub dogwoods and hazelnut and things, where you get canes that come up from the root system. With these, you're mostly doing removal cuts. You can do some reduction cuts, but the problem is, because of the way they grow, is basically you have one single stem with a lot of small branches off of it. So there's not really good places to do reduction cuts. And in this case, the big issue was that there were too many canes coming up, and they were starting to rub and squeeze on each other down here. So usually with these types of shrubs, instead of doing reduction cuts at nodes, you do removal cuts. And in this case, what I did was removal cuts at the base, at the ground level. So I just went in with my saw. And when you do this type of pruning on these types of shrubs, usually what you want to do is take out the biggest, oldest canes, because those are the ones that are closer to the end of the life. They will eventually die. So you're getting rid of the older stuff to make more room for the younger stuff to grow. It's still a little bit crowded in there, but not nearly as bad as it was before I did the cuts. The other thing about things like viburnums and the shrub dogwoods is we actually took what I cut out of here, we dipped it in Rootone, and we stuck it in the ground out at the USGSB lab, and about 50% of them are still growing out there. So you can make new plants just by doing these with these cuttings. For those more fountain types, you would do the same thing. As it starts to get a little crowded, you would start cutting out some of those canes, usually down at the bottom, because again, there's not a whole lot that you can work with in terms of doing the reductions. One of the things that you might do with some of your shrubs is what's called extensive rejuvenation. And some of them, like the shrub dogwoods, actually like you to do this because they evolved under heavier herbivory, where things like white-tailed deer and elk and moose are doing this to them naturally. And with this process, what you do is you cut all of the branches, cut everything down to about 6 to 10 inches above ground before bud break. Then as it resprouts, you manage those new sprouts where you're making removal cuts or reduction cuts, depending on the type of shrub, and whether or not you want this to be growing into the middle or out. You would do either, if you wanted to grow out, you would, when you're managing those new sprouts, you would reduce to outward facing buds If you want it to grow inward, you would reduce to inward facing buds. And as I said here, there is this VCE publication that has a list of shrubs you can do this to. And to that list, I would add the dogwoods and the beautyberry. And actually, the beautyberry you should do this to periodically, because this is what it needs, is that new vigorous growth to put out a lot of flowers and make a lot of berries. And as I said, I did the earlier, I did this with my Amorpha fruticosa. So this is another one you can do it to. This is what it looked like before I pruned it, or before I did the rejuvenation pruning. This is what it looked like afterwards. And this was in February of 2022. And you can see I made my reduction cuts. In this case, there was a whole bunch of buds here, so it was easy to find that node. Here is another bud and an example of that reducing to a bud. And this is what happened the next summer. All of this growth in here is new sprouts that came up off of that shrub. And I showed you a picture of what it looked like this February. You can also do this gradually. When we talked about doing the rejuvenation, I explained to my wife I wasn't sure if this is going to work. It might kill the shrub. We agreed that it's been there for 15 years. It's getting leggy. If it dies, we'll just replace it with something else. It was actually a little bigger than what we wanted to put there. I didn't realize how big that Amorpha fruticosa does. If, on the other hand, you want to make sure you want to keep the shrub and you're not sure this will work, you can do gradual rejuvenation. So this is like that extensive rejuvenation, only you do it over a 3-year period. So the first year you take 1/3 of the stems, and again, you would take the older stems, the ones that are are closer to having reaching the end of their lives, and see what happens. If you don't get good response, you can stop after you take 1/3. If you do get a good response, then you go in the second year and you take half of what's left. And then the third year, you take the rest of it. And as you're going through this process, you want to manage that regrowth to keep good shape on that shrub. So before we get into root pruning, are there any questions?
Yes, I on the subject of shrubs, the last part that you just talked about, the gradual rejuvenation. I've heard, I'm managing several red twig, 6 actually, red twig dogwoods. That's the process that we've been trying to use on them.
Right.
Generally, but you mentioned in the previous slide, you talked about the shrub dogwoods, and I assumed you meant red twig by that.
Well,
As
red twig,
in-
silky, and gray dogwood. The red twig is, there's some debate over whether that's native, but the silky and the gray dogwood are definitely Virginia natives.
Okay.
Okay.
So, but the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is a preferred treatment for red twig.
Okay. That may be. I do know that one place where red twigs are native are what they call parks out in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So those kind of big open grassy places, those shrubs that grow there are red twigs, and they get munched down a lot by the elk.
Okay.
And probably the buffalo. And so they have adapted to doing that too. And I know with my gray dogwoods, I have done that, done the extensive rejuvenation. Well, actually, it's not. What I've done is gone in and cut out some of the canes that have come up in places where I don't want them.
Mhm.
But I have heard that doing this is good for them. And it's also a great way to share that plant with your neighbors, because especially with the dogwoods. They do a really good job of sprouting back and turning into new plants from those cuts.
Okay, I did not know that, and I bet we could do that.
If you use a little rutone, that's the rooting hormone, you get a little better result. But with those shrub dogwoods, just sticking them in the ground. In fact, if you go online, it's a cheap way to get those plants is you can buy them as live stakes, which is just a length of that stem that has an angled cut at one end, and you just drive them into the ground and they become new plants. Willows do the same thing.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk about root prunings. And notice here I say not monocots. Monocots are characterized by roots that do not, what do I want to say? They don't split, they don't fork. They just grow straight down from a meristem, usually right below the surface of the ground. So for example, grass basically has two meristems, one on top of the other. The one that points up grows new shoots, new leaves and stems. The one that points down is what grows the roots, but they don't branch as they go down into the soil. So we don't really root prune monocots. But for dicots and the gymnosperms, we can root prune. And here now we are going to introduce heading cuts, because when we're doing root pruning, we want to make heading cuts. So all of the shortening we've been done has been done with the idea of controlling sprouting. When we make heading cuts, we're not controlling sprouting. That's one of the issues with topping the trees. But in the case of roots, we want sprouting. So when we make heading cuts on roots, especially roots that are less than 1 inch in diameter, they are going to sprout vigorously as we release them. And with gymnosperms, they do have suppressed buds in their, or suppressed root buds in their root system. So even with gymnosperms, when we make heading cuts on those roots, that will cause them to grow a lot of roots to replace what's been cut. And this is what I mean by a heading cut. So here you have a node, here you have a node, and we're making the cut between the nodes. In the past, if we wanted to shorten this branch, we'd come down here and we'd make a reduction cut. Now we're cutting here. And what that's going to do is release a lot of buds in here that are going to create sprouts. And we can actually use that to our advantage, especially if we're talking about transplanting larger things. Now, if you're talking about, oh, there's this new little oak tree that just sprouted in my yard, you don't have to go through this. But if you've waited 5 or 6 years, you might want to do root pruning before you try and transplant that. And the way this works is you start in the spring of the year before you want to transplant, and you take a sharp shovel, and starting about, depending on how big it is, if it's a 2-inch diameter, you might want to go 1.5 feet out to do this. But you would cut straight down, skip the width of the blade, and cut again until you go all the way around the circle. And so what that's going to do is cut about half of the roots at that distance from the trunk of the tree. And it's going to then promote sprouting and growth of absorbing roots in closer to the trunk of the tree. You come back in the fall and you finish the circle. So then you cut the other half and you allow those roots to grow over the winter. And then the next spring, after you start this process, you come out and you start digging about 6 inches outside that circle. And what this then will do is it will create a lot of roots in the root ball when you dig that plant up. This is why if you go to the nursery and you can find tree or plants, larger plants that have been root pruned before they're harvested, you're going to get a better product than if you just get one that's been dug up with one of those big machines, because you're not going to have as many roots in that root ball as with those machines as you do when they do the root pruning. If you're ever called on to consult with a construction project, it's important that you do root pruning at the edges of the clearing and grading. And when you do that, you want to use a sharp tool. This means backhoes are not what you do root pruning with. And ideally, you're going to expose those roots before cutting them. And again, as I said, there's this rule of thumb. Most people's thumbs are about 1 inch in diameter, but if the root's smaller than your thumb, it's going to seal over and it's going to sprout vigorously when it's cut. So the tree is going to make up for losing part of the root system very quickly on those smaller roots. Keep in mind that the bigger the root is and the closer it is to the stem, the more of the root system you're going to lose. So this is important when you start thinking about maybe planting under your trees, as well as doing this at construction. Ideally, you want to expose those roots with an air spade. Although more often this is done with what they call a ditch witch, which is kind of a saw that goes into the ground, and they're frequently used as part of installing silt fences. More practical application for tree stewards and gardeners is what you do when you've got a container plant and it's got a root system like this. You can see there are some roots here that have reached the edge. They're growing in the wrong orientation. They're circling. This has got a really dense root ball. I actually was planning on bare rooting this plant, but there was no way I was going to be able to break up that root ball. Some people faced with this will take a knife or something and start making vertical slits along the perimeter of the root ball. Other people will try and grab it at the base and butterfly it. They'll, kind of rip it apart. Some people will just kind of try and tease some of these roots out. The university research shows that actually the best thing to do is you take a saw or a shovel or a sharp shovel or something like that, and you actually slice off the edges of the root ball. So you go from something like this to something like this. And now what you've done, you can see some here is those roots that have reached the edge of the container and are growing in a wrong orientation have been cut off, and now they're growing in the right orientation. And then you just plant this the same way you would have planted any container plant. One of the things I would also point out is when you've got a really dense root ball like this from your container plants, they are going to dry out very quickly because they have way more absorbing roots than would be normal. And so this plant needed to be watered about 3 times a week when we put it in, when the other plants in the yard didn't need supplemental watering at all. And that was, my wife kept saying it was because I had done this to it. And I kept pointing out to her, no, it's because of how dense that those absorbing roots were. And it's just drying out really quickly. Okay. Any questions about root pruning? I know people get horrified by that whole idea of squaring the ball and cutting all those roots off. But as I said, those small roots regrow very quickly, and the tree is, or plants are constantly growing and shedding those fine roots.
Hey, Jim, this is Steve Geiger. I was wondering, could you just go over really quickly again that procedure for root pruning when you're transferring a plant
Sure.
or transplanting?
So what you want to do, and like I said, it's hard for me to say how far away from the trunk of the tree you're going, because it'll depend on how big the tree is. But for example, for a 2-inch caliper, this would be about 1.5 feet. And what you want to do is in the spring, go around this, and that's why it's a dotted line, is go around it. And generally what you can do is you drive your shovel into the ground, and it should be nice and sharp. And then you skip a width of the shovel and do it again, and skip a width and do it again until you go all the way around the tree. And what you're doing there, and this is why it's important that you have a sharp shovel, is you're cutting all of the roots that might be sticking out from here. And that is forcing them to start growing new roots in the portion that's still attached to the plant. Then in the late summer or early fall, you come back and you do that again, only this time you cut the roots that you missed in the spring. So you're going back and you're redoing those that whole process, only you're driving the shovel in between where you drove it in before. And then over the winter, those roots that you cut in the late summer or early fall will start growing roots. And this will create a better root ball for the transplanted plant than if you were to just dig it up, because you're getting more absorbing roots there in the center of the plant. And that's going to help it get enough water to support the crown of the tree, and then help it do the photosynthesis it needs to regrow the root system that it loses. And then in the spring, this distance is about 6 inches, and you just dig all the way around to get that root ball out of the ground. And then you can pick it up and move it to someplace else and plant it the way you would a bald and burlap tree.
Great,
Okay?
thank you.
Sure.
I have a question, Jim. We have a red bud, and it's a young red bud. It's been planted 3 years ago, or more, 4 years ago. And they built a sidewalk which took over the right of way. We had planted the trees so it wouldn't be too impacted for when they were going to do this sidewalk.
Right.
Now the sidewalk is inviting a lot of traffic, so we have to we want to do basically rebuild a hedge. We had a hedge before, and to kind of block traffic and invading dogs and stuff. So the limbs of the tree are reaching closer to where the planters would be, or the hedge would be. So is it reasonable to think that before we put in the planter, which might be getting over existing roots, we would cut sharply, we would cut where the planter is going to be sitting, so it would kind of free those roots from, I don't know if I make myself clear.
Yeah, I think what you're planning on putting in some hardscape that may interfere with the root system of that red bud.
Yeah.
My advice would be to not do that, especially since it's a fairly young tree. Let it make its own decisions about where it wants to grow the roots. Now, if you're going to do any excavation, So if you're going to dig that planter into the ground, then as you are doing the digging, you may, if you encounter some big roots, it would be a good idea to expose those roots and then use your pruning tools to make a good sharp cut, rather than just try and drive your shovel through it.
Okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But
Right.
otherwise, the tree will, if it decides those roots are no longer going to be useful or not getting anything, it will abandon them. But what we're finding is even under streets, trees are putting out roots. I saw a presentation by Davy Tree at one of the Northern Virginia Urban Forest Roundtables, where they were hired by Hartford, I think, to help with managing trees during a project where they were installing or they were trying to they had a combined sewer overflow and they're trying to separate the storm drain from the sewer.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to go, they were going to do it in the street. Well, before they did the project, Davey went in with ground penetrating radar and found out that there were a lot of tree roots under the street. So rather than just dig up the street, they actually brought in a machine and they pushed pipes through the ground under the root systems of those trees. So, we tend to think that the tree's not growing or getting anything under hardscape, but that may not be the case. So let the redbud decide whether or not it wants those roots and whether it can deal with those planters.
Well, actually, I was thinking of putting some stone-filled stones under these planters, so this way it would kind of leave some actually draining under the planters and.
Actually, that's not a good idea.
Oh, okay.
Because what'll happen is it's just like putting rocks in the bottom of your plant pot. And we're getting away from pruning now, we're going to soils. People will do that because you get this saturation zone at the bottom of the pot. Well, what'll happen is if you put that rock in there, it will fill, the area that you put the rock in will fill up with water before any of it will drain out. Because it's got a different texture than the soil. So when you do that, what you do is you raise the saturation zone, because the soil above those rocks won't give up water until it becomes completely saturated.
So is it better to do just the dirt, soil?
Just the dirt.
Just
the dirt. Otherwise, you're going to have you're going to create a perched water table under those planters.
Yeah, because there's a grading issue, but anyway, we're going into some specific case, but
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Pruning mature trees. Couple of caveats about pruning mature trees. Climbing trees is dangerous. In fact, tree climbing is a more dangerous profession than firefighting or police work. Using a chainsaw is also dangerous. When you use a chainsaw while you're climbing the trees, you are multiplying your dangerous activities. So I strongly recommend that you leave this work to trained professionals rather than doing it yourself, and you restrict yourself mostly to an advisory role where you're talking with a client and saying, yeah, you might want to prune here or here, but it's really something that should be turned over, especially if you got to climb into the tree to somebody who is trained to do that. I don't climb my trees. When I need to have pruning done up in the crowns of my trees, I hire a professional arborist to do it. But when we're looking at this, when we're looking at these mature trees, what you want to start doing is a structural evaluation. So again, you want to look at those scaffold branches and make sure they're well spaced, both vertically and radially. You want to be looking for good branch unions. Generally, this means there's going to be kind of a U shape with a visible bark ridge. There are some species like elms and lindens that, for whatever reason, they can survive having really tight branch unions and even having included bark in them. That's the way they grow. The other thing you want to look for are dead or broken or diseased or overlong branches. With very long branches, especially with ice storms and snowstorms, that can cause problems, and you can get structural defects, or you can get failures because of just the physics of the length of the lever arm and the amount of weight you're putting on the end. Generally, with mature trees with those overlong branches, that's where you're looking at doing reduction cuts rather than removal cuts. Because even with mature trees, that 1/3 aspect ratio comes into play, and you may also, especially with the oaks, be looking at branches that already have heartwood in them. And so you're going to be exposing heartwood in the trunk of the tree if you try and prune things off. One of the things to keep in mind, this is a shear plane crack that I discovered, and notice it got better. So a saw or loppers, pruning tools are not the only tools in the toolbox. This could have been corrected by bolting this back together, by running some bolts through this branch and actually bolting them up. In this case, they didn't do anything. You can see that it's already sealed up this part of the crack and this part of the crack, and this is not too far behind. There's still a crack in here, but the tree is actually healing it. Included bark. In this case, this is not a branch union. This branch came out here. This branch came out here. This is one of those issues. I let my scaffold branches get away from me on the crabapple, and they've actually grown together. And I would expect that over time, this is going to become a single branch union. And you'll just have those two branches coming out. But this is what can happen where you've got two loci of growth here, and you'll have bark growing between them. And keep in mind that as this is going on, you've got growth that's centered here and growth that's centered here, and those two pieces are getting trying to do diameter growth, and so they're pushing against each other. So you have forces in this where you've got this included bark that are pushing these two pieces away from each other inside the tree. And when a storm hits, it can reinforce that, and you wind up with this. This is what I call hand of God pruning of calorie pear. And this is not the worst I've seen. I've seen trees where every one of those scaffold branches is on the ground. And so you wind up with a stump with a bunch of broken branches around it. But that's because calorie pear, especially the Bradford pears, are very prone to having that included bark and those bad branching. Here is, this is actually one of my work colleagues sent me these pictures. This is a red bud, and you can see the included bark here. And after that winter storm, you can see what happened to the tree. He did this, well, actually, he didn't do the 3-cut method. I think he just cut off here. And then in order to deal with this, he cut through here. Now, there are a couple of things that he could have done here. Before the storm, he could have bolted this together again to reinforce this joint. But you can see the included bark here, and that this had not formed a good union. Red buds are famous for doing this, but bolting this would have reinforced it. The other thing is that after the storm, he could have also bolted it, and there was a good chance, because this looks like it was a pretty clean break, there's a good chance that this would have healed. And by bolting it, what I mean is you drill holes and run carriage bolts through here. You tighten them down, then you cut off the end of the threads, and you take your ball peen hammer and flatten out or peen that thing over so that it can't loosen. And you might have to put 2 or 3 bolts in it. The other thing that he could have done was to prune this off. And so when you have a branch union like this, instead, because there is no branch collar here and there's no branch protection zone, there's nothing to protect. So typically what you're going to do if you want to remove this branch, and I know this might violate that 1/3 aspect ratio, but keep in mind, you already have a good part of this wound sealed. So what you would do is cut straight in, sort of like he did down here, straight into that seam, and then this part comes off. And you have actually a relatively small wound there that needs to be healed. Yes? Hello?
Somebody needs to mute themselves.
So this would be one of the ways you could deal with a relatively small bad branch union. If this was a much bigger tree, then you might have to go up and cable it, because then you would be making a really big wound on this tree. This is one of those future problems. Like I said, in my crabapple, I noticed that these 2 branches were growing pretty close together. Again, this is something where if you're paying attention, you can deal with it when they're small. I didn't notice it until it got pretty big. And so what I've done is I decided that I wanted to keep this branch, and I went up this branch and I found a place here where I did a reduction cut to try and slow this down, and I may eventually remove that branch from the tree. When I was doing it, I was originally going to reduce to this lateral, but my wife pointed out that there was a canker up here. So it doesn't make sense to reduce to a diseased lateral, and I moved further down the trunk and found another branch to deal with. But when you see stuff like this in a more mature tree, one of the things you can do is removal cut, because that is probably a diseased branch. Now, there are a few standard pruning practices that you encounter with mature trees. Crown cleaning, which is essentially removing those dead, diseased, and broken branches. Sometimes we do crown raising. This again is when we have issues with clearance. Here we're doing removal cuts on those lower branches. If they are exceeding that aspect ratio, that 1/3 aspect ratio, then we might do reduction cuts, especially if we are doing the crown raising for clearance. It may not work if you're doing it for the view. We sometimes do crown thinning where we're removing some of the smaller interior and exterior branches. It's really important when you do this that it gets spread over the entire crown of the tree. You don't want to lion tail the tree. And this is what I mean by lion tailing.
I I have a
beforehand,
question.
sure.
This is Melissa. So it's very common practice for people to basically cut the insides out of a tree as an aesthetic thing, and you'll see it a lot in vase-shaped trees. And so could you answer when would be the time that you would do a crown thinning?
If you felt like the tree was too exposed and subject to heavy winds, you might do a crown thinning. But what happens when you do that, where you cut out all the interior and just leave the branches, the exterior branches, you're actually reducing that mass dampening, and you are increasing the wind resistance of those branches, because you lost all that interior stuff that can dampen the force of the wind against it. That's why, like I said, it's really important that you do interior and exterior branches, and you really get that thinning evenly distributed across the crown of the tree. Not just focusing on the branches on the interior, or in the case of lion tailing, where you're cutting all the stuff off the bottom of the tree. So this is what it looked like, the tree looked like before, and I'm sure that the discount cleaners wanted people to be able to see their sign. And so they went in and they didn't want to remove the tree, but what they did was they lion tailed it. They cut all the branches off the bottom so you could see it. This is fairly common. I actually saw at Springfield Plaza where they not only did this to the bottom, but then they went up at the top and they topped the tree. They cut the small branches so it's it looks nice and even at the top and the bottom. And the problem that happens when you do this is, in this case, they took off way more than 25% of the live crown, but they've also messed up the lever arms. So now you have all the weight of the tree, and when the wind blows, all the force is up here, but the bending moment for the tree is still where it was down here. And because you've got all this weight and these long levers, if you've ever seen, I think about, kids on a teeter-totter, where you've got the teenager sits on one end, and the elementary school, the 6-year-old is dangling up in the air because you put all the weight on there. What this leads to frequently is a windstorm that before it was pruned, the tree just would have shook and swayed. Same windstorm now blows this tree over because you get so much force and such a long lever arm down here to the base. The other problem is that whoever did this was trying to kill themselves, because you don't enter a tree by a ladder. I can imagine that whoever did these cuts climbed up this tree, cut these branches off, and just let them fall to the ground. And then when they had to reach higher, excuse me, simply went up there and weren't tied in at all. And this, of course, is the lion's tail, which is why we call this lion tailing. Not a good thing to do to your tree. You're really messing up the physics of the tree. Now, sometimes you don't have a choice. In 2013, I came home and the wind had broken the top out of my pawpaw tree. So what I did was go, and this is what you would do with any broken branches. You can either go to a lateral or do a removal cut, depending on what it is. In this case, because the central leader was broken, I went to this lateral and I did a reduction cut. This gives the plant, the tree, a nice, smooth, even cut that it can deal with. And then it turned this one into the central leader, and you can see it's starting to grow more upright. And that's because what's happening is the forces on the cambium are starting to cause it to grow more wood here and start pushing this upwards. And you can't really see, but there's a wound there from when I did the cut. Not an ideal situation, but this is how I fixed it after it broke.
I'm sorry, which of the branches, the left or the right, did you do the reduction cut on?
I did the reduction cut on the central leader. So the tree used to, you can see where the wound is here. It used to have a piece that went up here, and that's what broke off.
Oh,
So I went below the break, and I reduced to this lateral, but I did the reduction cut on the central leader of the tree.
okay, to the lateral branch. Thank you.
To the lateral branch, yeah. And I did that because that was where I could best work with the plant and the evolution of the plant to deal with the wound that was created by the storm. So that's all I had. Whoops, went the wrong way. That's all I had for you today. I guess we're going to meet someplace on Saturday. And we still have about 20 minutes if you guys have any questions.
I can tell you where we're meeting on Saturday,
Okay.
if I can pronounce it. This is Melissa Gilday. If everyone doesn't know me, my hair's in my eyes. I'm looking for we're meeting at Sitkalasaw, that's at Arlington County Park at 3011 7th Street North. So I can put that in the chat here if there's chat.
Could you spell the name of the park as well?
It's ZITKALA dash at capital S lowercase a.
Yeah, it's in Lion Park. It's just above Lion Park.
I
And
think it was
we're meeting
recently
at 9.
renamed.
Right.
I'm sorry, Melissa, can you give me the address again?
Yes, it's 3011 7th Street North.
It came up just fine when I put in that name in a navigation app.
It's just a hard name to spell.
Yes.
I put it in the chat. If everyone has access to it, maybe you can copy it.
I'll email it out too.
Okay.
It's named for a kind of interesting Native American woman if you want to Google sometime.
And that's from 9 to 11, Melissa.
That's what I have in my calendar.
Yeah.
And then we can all go to Green
I'm
Spring.
going
and
to
buy
end the
native
chat
plants.
now. I mean, I will stop the recording unless people wanted their questions recorded. Okay, I'll stop it.
Do you want us?
Is there like street parking